Hi there. Welcome to another edition of the Israel-Palestine Report. After a long time of quiet on the front of the hostage negotiations, or quiet's the wrong word, lack of any advancement, there's a lot of moving parts all of a sudden on this front. And perhaps the most confusing thing of all is that the demands of Hamas and the demands of Israel appear to have reversed themselves, strangely, with Israel, which was insisting on a partial hostage release, now insisting on on a deal that would end the conflict, and Hamas that insisted on a deal that would end the conflict, now talking about a partial release along the lines of the Witkoff agreement that it recently turned down. So, what exactly is going on, and what has changed? Well, a lot has changed. The military operation, such as it is, um, focused on Gaza City, has changed a lot of the dynamics, and the involvement of the Trump administration has changed a lot of the dynamics. So right now we have a partial ceasefire agreement suggested by Egypt and Qatar that has been accepted by Hamas. The proposal is very close to the Witkoff framework with some minor adjustments. So it's called Witkoff Plus. And Israeli officials have said that it's 98% similar to an earlier US backed plan that Hamas had rejected and Israel has accepted. Um, a source that is involved in the negotiations told Ynet this definitely forms a basis that will allow rapprochement talks between Israel and Hamas to close a deal. And now the ball is in Israel's court. So the terms are indeed very familiar. We're talking about a ceasefire that would last 60 days. It would involve Israel receiving 10 live hostages and 18 deceased hostages, and a number of Palestinian prisoners. The number of Palestinian prisoners remains in dispute, but the negotiations have narrowed in the gaps. Hamas was demanding 200 prisoners. Now it's demanding 140 to 150. Israel has offered 125. As for the security perimeter on the borders, Hamas wants 800 meters to a kilometer, and Israel wants a kilometer to 1.2 kilometers in terms of the security region abutting the border. So the differences are very minor there, and it's difficult for Israel to say no to this deal. But that hasn't stopped Israel from trying. Netanyahu acknowledged the reports that Hamas had said yes to the deal and said, I hear the reports just like you do. And from them, you can conclude one thing: Hamas is under atomic pressure. So, what he's saying there, or what that implies, is that it's not necessarily the time to go to a deal now, but rather to apply more pressure on them to release uh, more of the hostages. And Israel added insult to injury by saying Israel's position has not changed: the release of all hostages and adherence to the other conditions defined for ending the war. Of course, that hasn't been Israel's position the whole time. Indeed, for most of this conflict, Israel has been trying to get a partial release of hostages and then continue the war after it's done. Meanwhile, Hamas has insisted on getting an end to the war, something that Israel has resisted. But now Netanyahu's office is saying it will only accept a deal if all hostages are released at once. Ron Dermer, who is the minister closest to Netanyahu and the one who's supposed to be handling negotiations over the hostages, though so far in his tenure, no hostages have been released. He reportedly told the cabinet that if Israel agrees to a 60-day ceasefire without a full deal, it would be impossible to restart the military operations due to external pressure, especially from Donald Trump. And that's why they're insisting on a deal now. That was reported by Channel 12. It's really not clear that that is true. In fact, previous precedent shows that Israel has been able to restart the war after these sorts of pauses in the past. There have been at least two of them. There are other terms to the deal that is currently being proposed aside from the hostages and the prisoner exchange that I already mentioned. Humanitarian aid will be sent in immediately, and that's one of the reasons that Hamas is agreeing, of course, including fuel, water, electricity, hospital, bakery repairs, and rubble removal equipment. The aid distribution will be overseen by the UN, Red Cross, and international agencies. Um, the current GHF distribution will not be completely replaced, but will be supplemented. The Rafah crossing would be open both ways to allow in aid and allow out, and the release of all Palestinian children and women prisoners held by Israel is included. So Hamas is giving some very positive indications about this. Hamas official told Al-Sharq al-Aswat the proposal carries positive points, and the gaps between Hamas's demands and what was offered are narrow. Now the ball is in Israel's court. The Egyptian foreign minister said the proposal addressed obstacles like aid mechanisms and Israel's military deployments. Not clear what the military deployments there would be. It would have to be somewhere, something in between what Hamas wants, which is a full withdrawal, and what Israel wants just to remain basically where they are at the moment. Then Trump, of course, tweeted something very interesting. He said um, that uh, there won't be a release of hostages until Hamas is ultimately defeated. And that sounds like the kind of messaging that Netanyahu told him to use in order to avoid a ceasefire now. Here's the full phrasing that he used. We will see the return of the remaining hostages when they confront Hamas and it is destroyed. I was the only one who negotiated and secured the release of hundreds of hostages for Israel and America. I ended a war, a 6 year war in 6 months. I was the only one who destroyed Iran's nuclear facilities. Play to win or don't play at all. So obviously the main point there is how great Trump is. But if you look at what he said about Hamas, he's saying that Hamas needs to be destroyed or the hostages will not be released. And that goes against previous American messaging, which was that hostages have to be released, and the Witkoff deal, which had a partial release. And what's interesting is that these negotiations are taking place while the biggest protests ever have taken place in Israel. Reportedly, 2 million Israelis at least took part in the events of protest and a strike in Israel calling for the release of the hostages and the end of the war. Netanyahu and his government said that these demonstrations are aiding and abetting Hamas and hardening their position. But we saw that that's not true. On the same day as the protests were occurring, Hamas agreed to a partial deal, something that seems to have caught Israel off guard and led to a change in its ultimate position. The criticism of Netanyahu domestically is very severe, more severe than it ever has been. It's been severe for a very long time. The Hostages and Missing Families Forum said the hostages have languished in Gaza for 22 months on your watch. Opposition leader Yair Lapid criticized Netanyahu and said the man who time and again refused to eliminate Hamas's leaders before October 7th doesn't know how to win, doesn't want to free the hostages. He needs an eternal war to cling to his seat. But as we know, members of Netanyahu's government are pushing very hard for the continuation of the military operation. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir not only support the expansion of the operation into Gaza City, they also demand an escalation throughout all of Gaza that will lead to the defeat of Hamas and to the ethnic cleansing of Gaza from its residents. So uh, we have the same issue that we always have had before. Uh, Incredible pressure from the Israeli public to get a hostage deal, time running out for the hostages, but also the internal dynamic of pressure from Smotrich and Ben Gvir. And just to put things into context, Netanyahu's government has never been more tenuous in all that time. He's had um, Haredi parties leave because of his inability to defend them from um, uh, the army drafting Haredi men. And he's also had Smotrich say that Netanyahu is unable or unwilling to defeat Hamas in the war, and that he's considering leaving the government as a result. And if elections were called now, it would be less than a year early from the maximal time in which they would have to be called. So there's really a question of how much longer this government can continue to march on. So the important thing to watch is what happens now. Hamas has agreed to a partial deal. That places Israel in a position that they're not used to being in, where Hamas has very clearly said yes. What Hamas usually does is play around, say that we have a positive answer, we don't have a positive answer, we want to change this, we want to change that. Now Hamas has just said yes, and that places the onus on Israel. Netanyahu is going to try to move towards, and already has, we're only going to accept a final deal. But of course, a final deal is something that Israel's not willing to do. It's not willing to give the guarantees to end the war that Hamas wants. Um, so then the question becomes, who gets blamed for the failure of hostage talks, or will Netanyahu be willing to make those sacrifices, make that last partial deal that would leave Hamas with very few hostages left alive, 60 more days of ceasefire before Israel would try to renew it. But would the government survive that sort of move? So we'll be following this very closely here. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon, listen to my newly rebranded podcast, Histories of the Holy Land podcast, and read my Substack, The Grand Scheme. I will see you here the next time something interesting happens.